Cruising on the Great Lakes was a very popular summer pastime for many Greater Clevelanders. The flagship of the Canadian steamship line was the SS Noronic. She was the largest and finest passenger ship on the Great Lakes and was known as the Queen of the Lakes. During the summer months, the Noronic provided service between Windsor, Detroit, and Duluth. Each year in September, her itinerary was changed to accommodate 7-day cruises between Detroit, Cleveland, Toronto, and Prescott. September 14, 1949, the Noronic left Detroit on her last cruise of the season. That evening at 11 p.m., with about 300 passengers, she headed across Lake Erie for Cleveland. She docked in Cleveland the following morning and began boarding more passengers. Herbert and Ethel Cannell of Twinsburg were among the passengers who boarded that afternoon. Around 10 p.m., the Noronic left Cleveland with 524 passengers and headed east to the Welland Canal. The locks on the Welland Canal lowered ships about 100 meters before entering Lake Ontario. The following afternoon, the Noronic passed through the canal and into Lake Ontario. She turned and headed to Toronto. She reached Toronto that evening around 6 p.m. She docked at Pier 9. Some of the passengers and crew embarked for a night in Toronto. Captain Taylor left the ship to attend a dinner party with friends. Of a crew of 171, only 15 were on duty that night. Around 2 a.m., the captain returned to the ship and retired to his quarters on A deck. At 2:30 a.m., Don Church, a passenger from Silver Lake, Ohio, was returning to his cabin when he noticed a smoky haze in the passageway on C deck. He followed it to a locked linen closet. He ran to the social hall and notified a bellboy. The bellboy ran to the steward's office on D deck to retrieve the key. When he opened the closet door, the oxygen-starved fire exploded into the hallway. They attempted to fight the blaze with fire extinguishers, but were forced to retreat almost immediately. The nearby fire hoses lacked water pressure and were useless. The fire was spreading fast, fueled by the wood paneling on the walls and ceilings that had been polished with lemon oil for years. The bellboy returned to the social hall and rang the fire bell, then notified the captain and first mate. The first mate rushed to the wheelhouse and sounded the klaxon horn, which was supposed to be one long blast, 2 short blasts, and ending with another long blast. The klaxon horn ceased and emitted a continuous blast without pause. Later, for those had heard it that night, called it the Noronic's death cry. The first mate then sounded the ship's whistle. The night watchman on the pier noticed an orange glow. He turned and saw the smoke and flames. He called the fire department to report the fire. As the fire grew and spread, he called the police department. Then, as injured passengers reached the dock, he called to request all available ambulances and medical staff. At 2:38 a.m., only minutes after the fire was discovered, half of the ship's decks were on fire. By chance, a Goodyear tire worker was on his way home after the late shift, saw the fire, and stopped to help. He saw there were only 2 gangplanks extended to the dock. He pushed a nearby painting rig in place and helped escaping passengers to the dock. There was an overhead gangplank used by passengers disembarking from the SS Cayuga, an 1,800-passenger ship that was docked at another pier nearby, but the Noronic wasn't spotted to use it when she docked. Most of the crew evacuated at the first sound of the ship's whistle. Only the captain and a few remaining crew were left to notify sleeping passengers, shouting and pounding on cabin doors. Awakened passengers were shocked and confused. They couldn't believe what was happening and didn't know what to do. Seeing heavy smoke, heat, and flames caused a panic and hysteria. They only had a few minutes to make a decision. For many, it proved fatal. Also on board that night was a truck driver from the steamship line. Sam Graham had delivered a truckload of fruits and vegetables, but arrived late in the evening. He was told to spend the night aboard the Noronic, and his truck would be unloaded in the morning. He was given a cabin on C deck. Sam was awakened by a commotion outside his cabin. He opened his door and saw the flames and smoke. He rushed down the passageway, through the bar door, and to the outside deck and finally to the dock. When he reached the dock, he went to move his truck out of the way of the arriving fire trucks, but he had no keys because he forgot to put on his pants. Sam went to get a pair of pants from the crew of the Cayuga docked nearby. While aboard the Cayuga, he ran into employees Louisa Dustin and Nellie Burr, both passengers of the Noronic, who were visiting a friend on the Cayuga. After telling them about the fire, they both raced back to rescue Nellie's daughter, Ira. Nellie and Ira were both employed at the CSL Laundry in Point Edward. They were very familiar with the Noronic passageways from years of stocking fresh linens. Louisa and Nellie found Ira asleep in her room. As the three women were exiting the ship, they split up. Nellie and Ira headed for the dock, and Louisa returned to her cabin to retrieve her payroll ledgers. She had taken the payroll ledgers on her cruise to keep them up to date. Nellie and Ira made it safely to the dock, but Louisa suffered severe burns. Herbert and Ethel Cannell of Twinsburg were also on sea deck in cabin 422, just down the passageway from where the fire started. Ethel heard the commotion and awoke to the smell of smoke. She woke Herbert and grabbed her purse as they ran out of the cabin. Their only escape was down a rope that was tied to the pier. They both started to shimmy down the rope but couldn't hold on. They both fell to the water below. Ethel couldn't swim. Herbert and Ethel struggled trying to reach the dock. The ship's whistle and screams from escaping and trapped passengers filled the air. By now, the fire department was starting to arrive. In a few minutes, the dock started to fill with police, firemen, and bystanders trying to rescue passengers from the burning ship and from the harbor. Firemen lowered ladders into the water. The overloaded ladders quickly sank into the soft harbor bottom from the weight of the passengers. Ropes were used and worked the best to lift passengers to the dock. Somehow, during the panic and confusion, Herbert and Ethel were rescued and pulled to safety. They were both severely burned and in shock. They were taken to St. Michael's Hospital. The scale of the rescue created a shortage of ambulances. Taxi cabs came from nearby hotels to help transport injured passengers to local hospitals. Cars parked along the dock prevented fire trucks from getting close to the fire. The first aerial fire truck extended its ladder to B deck. It had barely reached the ship when a group of panicked passengers climbed on the end, caused the ladder to snap, hurling the passengers into the harbor. A second aerial ladder truck arrived and extended its ladder to the ship. This time, the firemen prevented the ladder from breaking by bracing the ladder to support more weight. At 2:46 a.m., the first two fireboats arrived at the scene and began pouring water into the ship. So much water was poured on the Noronic that it had started to list towards the dock and was feared it would capsize. At 5 o'clock a.m., the fire was finally out. The ship was still too hot to board and was left to cool. By now, the ship was sitting on the bottom with E and D decks submerged. The bridge and wooden superstructure of the top two decks were gone, consumed by the fire. The fire department continued pumping water on the Noronic to cool it. At 7 o'clock a.m., the ship had cooled enough for the recovery of bodies began. Ironically, the Noronic was originally scheduled to leave Toronto 12 hours later and head to Prescott, Ontario. Many passengers burned to death in their cabins or in groups in the stairwell. Some passengers were on fire when they jumped overboard. The recovered bodies were transferred to a temporary morgue set up in the Horticulture Building on the Canadian National Exhibition grounds. In the days that followed, family and friends waited in line to file past piles of clothing, rings, jewelry, and dentures to identify their loved ones. The fire was so hot and burned so long that for most victims were little more than ashes. Crews collected and transported all the ashes so they could be searched. The identification process was slow and tedious and took over a year to complete. Some remains were never identified and were buried in a mass grave at Mount Pleasant Cemetery. The inscription on the monument reads, "In memory of those who lost their lives in the fire which destroyed the passenger steamship Noronic, September 17, 1949. The official death toll was 119, 1 Canadian and 118 Americans. The Canadian was Louisa Dustin, who had made it off the ship with Nellie and Ira, but died 3 weeks later from the burns she suffered. After a month of salvage work, the hull of the Noronic was refloated. On the morning of October 29th, the Noronic took her final journey to the scrapyard in Hamilton. A small group stood quietly on the pier as the Noronic was pulled away. Once the crowd dispersed, two men in a small boat began dragging the muddy bottom, searching for possible remains. Herbert and Ethel Cannell spent 2 painful months at St. Michael's, recovering from the burns before returning to Twinsburg. Herbert was a member of the Twinsburg Rotary. He returned to Toronto to present plaques from the Twinsburg Rotary Club to the Toronto and Leaside Rotary Clubs for the kindness they showed Herbert and Ethel during their recovery. Herbert and Ethel remained in Twinsburg for the rest of their life. They never went on a cruise again. Herb returned to his job with the Ohio Natural Resources. He spent his summers fishing with his grandchildren and playing croquet with the All-In Croquet Club. When Ethel rushed out of the cabin with her purse, she inadvertently carried away 2 souvenirs, their cabin key and a small creamer she took from the dinner table. The Noronic disaster triggered dramatic changes in passenger ship safety on the Great Lakes. Older ships were no longer exempt from complying with new safety regulations. Due to retrofit costs, older ships quickly disappeared. Coincidentally, both the Harmonic and Quebec, both CSL ships, were lost to fires. In July 1945, on a trip from Detroit to Duluth, the SS Harmonic stopped overnight in Point Edward. There was a fire on the dock that spread towards the Harmonic. The crew were unable to build up enough steam to prevent the ship from burning. They were barely able to pull away from the dock. Later, the ship ran aground. In August 1950, the SS Quebec caught fire on the St. Lawrence waterway. There were 7 fatalities. The tragedy could have been much worse. Captain Birch decided against launching lifeboats out in the St. Lawrence, instead sailing the ship to the dock in Tuduzik and disembarking the passengers. The ship was a loss, but probably saved lives. The glory days of cruising the Great Lakes are gone, but not forgotten. Today, the Canadian Steamship Line operates a fleet of 21 bulk carriers.
At this time, fire and police crews arrived. They showed up, and the Noronic, of course, was just, it happened so quickly. It was an inferno. The crew spent most of their efforts in rescue work and did an outstanding job. They did all they could. Even before they arrived, though, many people had to make a choice to stay on the flaming Noronic or to jump, and those who jumped on the water side were plunged into terrifying depths before they could fight their way back to the surface. Those trapped on the pier side had an even tougher decision to make. It was a long, long jump down, and you'd be risking more than a few broken bones. In fact, one woman plunged headfirst onto the dock, and she died very soon after from monstrous head wounds.
You know, many of the people who jumped into the water were picked up by Ross Leach, who operated a water taxi from the mainland to the islands. He was about to make his final trip when he saw the fire on the ship. Well, with his crew of George English and Cecil Mackey, they made trip after trip from the water near the boat to the dock and managed to pick up close to 50 people in a very dangerous area.
Some who jumped didn't hit the water, but landed on a deck or went through the roof of a cabin. The decks became slippery with blood. 2 Toronto detectives who arrived at the scene saw that Ross Leach and his crew needed help, and they acted very quickly. They stripped off their clothes and shoes and dove in, and they stayed in the water for over an hour, and believe me, it was cold. Now, that was pretty brave act on their part.
Indeed it was, and many of those who had jumped from the ship were burned, injured, or both, and every now and then one would give up the struggle and just sink from sight. But each time that happened, Cyril Cole or Robert Anderson, the 2 detectives, would dive and haul the potential victim back to the surface. And because of these rescue efforts, only 1 passenger from the Noronic drowned, which is quite amazing. The city's hospitals, hotels, and taxi drivers all gave tremendous help and service. But the grimmest scene was at the horticultural building at the CNE grounds, because this was turned into a temporary morgue, and the bodies, most of them burned beyond recognition, were brought to this building for identification. In fact, 4 bodies were never identified.